Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a special mix of episode 10 and 11. Every podcaster has some dream guests, and when I started thinking about this episode, a particular neuroscientist came immediately to mind. So I took my shot. When he said yes, that he'd come on the show, I was floored. He is the author of one of my favorite books, and I've been following his writings for many years. If you've never read The Upward Spiral and have never heard of Alex Korb, you're in for a treat. Dr. Alex Korb is a neuroscientist, researcher, professor, and best-selling author of The Upward Spiral. He has studied the brain for over 20 years. He earned his undergraduate degree in neuroscience at Brown University and completed a PhD in neuroscience at UCLA. He has published over a dozen peer-reviewed journal articles on depression, neuromodulation, and other topics. He is currently a professor at UCLA in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. As a consultant, he works with companies and organizations to help them improve communication about neuroscience and enhance employee well-being. When I set out to cover this topic, the neuroscience of outrage porn, I had this naive vision of a neat little Schoolhouse Rock cartoonish picture. When this happens, this part of the brain turns on kind of thing.
There's a telegram for you, ma'am, and the message is clear. It says there's something bugging you and buzzing in your ear. The results can be quite itchy, so what is your reply? Tell you're on to swat that fly. Hey, there's a telegraph line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system.
Of course, the reality is much more complicated than that, and it can even be different for different people. And that's why I have experts like Alex Korb on this show to give us the nuanced reality to my cartoonish visions. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, we're going to learn what's going on in our brain when we're confronted with outrage porn and ways to better handle the resulting emotions. There's so much good content here. Let's get to it.
Hey, there's a telegraph line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system, and everybody understands those telegram commands, and you know that everybody better listen.
Well, yeah, so I really can't tell you how much I appreciate you making time to come on the show. I think our listeners are going to be, to some extent, this might be a super selfish episode because I'm going to love it, but I think the listeners will as well. I think it'll be really fun. So thanks for coming on, Alex. I really appreciate you making the time.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about what the podcast is about, and how we have this kind of this odd, perverse pleasure out of seeing people on the other side do things that make us angry. And of course the media, sort of has figured this out about us. So they use it, they kind of weaponize it and constantly feed us that stuff to help them get ratings and clicks and likes and reshares and all that stuff. And they just feed us this stuff. And then, a lot of the other research that I've looked at shows how much we like it and we share it and we want more of it and that kind of thing. And it seems like there's even some research saying like the more sort of animosity is loaded into these messages, the more we like it. So, I would love to just hear about like what's going on in our brains with that and what's what is happening there? How is this happening to us?
Yeah, it's there's definitely a lot going on in our brains there. And one of the things to recognize is that these people who are trying to profit off that, either through fundraising or just various social media platforms, they don't necessarily understand the neuroscience. They've just, through testing all of these different messages, have sort of figured out what are the different strings that they can pull. And it's just basically they figured out the ways to exploit certain tendencies of our brains. And there's not just one tendency that's going on. It's like, oh, how do you balance your stress with your sense of connection with others, with taking action? And like, you have to really tune it in to optimize. And it's also different between different people, which is why they have, everything segmented, so that, the one message that would make you take, righteous action is different from what someone else is. But the main point I want to make is that there's a lot of different brain systems involved in this. That's, I think, what makes it so interesting, that it's not just one thing. But one place to start is just with our stress response and how the stress system works. We have a part of our brain, particularly that's involved in emotions, and the amygdala is a particularly important part of that. And its job, or one of its main jobs, is to pay attention to information or events that are threatening, or potentially threatening, or potentially out of our control, that we might need to take action on. And the reason it evolved that way is so that we can be on high alert and better prepared to take action. So, like, if you had to wait until you were, in danger to take action, well, you put yourself at unnecessary risk a lot. Like, if you had to wait until the lion was chasing you to start running, well, you might not survive as well. If you can anticipate and be like, oh, that field looks like a place where lions might hang out, and other parts of the brain are involved, like, oh yeah, that happens before, that reminded me of someone else. Like, it can activate our emotional circuitry and put us on high alert. And that activation of our stress response and of the amygdala trigger us to enact our habits. And all of this can be really fast and unconscious. And so when we see this information flowing in, our brain is scanning it, even subconsciously, even before we can consciously process it, for potential threats. And it's going to take action based on those threats and make us feel emotions based on those threats in a really rapid way.
Right. So, there's a lot, we also seem to have this, talk to a lot of psychologists that kind of talk about the sort of evolutionary tendencies towards sort of grouping and us's and them's and all that. And it seems like some of this messaging sort of seems to play into that too. They're somehow kind of reinforcing that this person we've already decided is kind of a them or bad. And they're just kind of reinforcing that we made the right choice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so that is this whole other system, that interacts as well with the emotional circuitry that I just described. But that's about the fact that humans are a social species, and we need each other to survive and thrive. I think sometimes people think of our biology as kind of being like a plant. Like, oh, well, if you just give a person, the right chemicals, you give enough water and food, then, you can survive. But that's not really true when it comes to people. Like, if you just raised a child in extreme isolation, and this unfortunate, like, this has been seen, in people in very unfortunate circumstances, that the brain just doesn't develop properly. And oftentimes kids just don't survive if they don't have people to connect with and nurture them. Like, so even if oh, you give them enough water and you give them enough food. Like that's not enough to fully develop as a human and to, in some cases, to even survive. We need connection with other people in order to get us to connect with each other. Our brain utilizes a couple different systems that had evolved for other purposes. One, it makes it really enjoyable and rewarding to connect with people and be supported by them. But two, it makes it really stressful and painful to experience social rejection. And so there's this deep connection between our social connection and our stress response, whereby connecting with people helps calm us down and feel better, particularly when we are threatened. So if we're threatened by some other group of people, it primes us to strengthen the connections of the people who we identify with, who we are already sort of connected to. And that's why like trust plays this crucial role in human well-being, that you really have to know, like, well, who is it that you can trust? Because then connecting with them makes you safer and makes you feel safer and reduces your stress. And who can you not trust, or who's the bad person or the bad guy? And like, that's who you should activate your stress response and make you more on edge. And we have all of these shorthand ways for identifying who that is, because in the old days things were much simpler. And oftentimes I think when stuff that we do in modern society doesn't make sense, it's always helpful to think about, well, how the brain evolved in this way, because it usually makes a lot more sense. And so all of this makes a lot more sense if you think about the brain 50,000 years ago, when we lived in small tribes of 50 or 100 or 150 people. And if you were excluded from the tribe, well, that was basically a death sentence, because you're left on your own and you're gonna die. That's why it activates the same systems as being attacked by a lion. And well, how do you know who to trust? Well, it's the people that you're around all the time, who you interact with all the time, who you know. And who should you not trust? Everybody else, because they're potentially a threat. And this like tribalistic urge that we have, well, that was a real feature of the brain that helped us survive and evolve. And so that's one of the reasons we have it. It's just that in an advanced, large, multicultural society, well, that sometimes gets in the way. And so we can't just rely on, people who we know directly and who interact with. So we use all these shorthand markers of like, well, what, are they, or do they say they're Republican or a Democrat? Or like, do I know them? Do I watch them on TV a lot? Or, did my friend recommend them? And how much of myself do I see in them? How much do they look like me? And we use all these sort of shorthand metrics for sort of trigger those same tribalistic tendencies. And we may not even be consciously aware of that, because these emotional circuits and these habit circuits often act really quickly before we're even consciously aware of them.
Right. Yeah. And there's definitely a lot of research that shows most of the time we're definitely not aware from what I've seen, where, things like, yeah, you sort of can't control it. And, and then that kind of gets to this, is there a way to recognize it? And is there a way to sort of figure out if it's helping me or hurting me in this scenario? Because it seems like, I think there was some other research I was looking at that sort of talked about how outrage itself seems to have evolved to almost like be an enforcer of norms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And norms play into this moralization side.
Right.
And it seems like when things kind of cross over, like particularly let's if we think about like the politics, maybe in America particularly, but it's kind of going on other places too, where it's like we've sort of gone from the other side is no longer simply the loyal opposition. They're sort of now our arch enemy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's become moralized. I mean, does something change, kind of in our brain about that too? Does that have an effect that we've kind of moved how we think about that in some way?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's sort of like that's kind of the more natural state. Like we kind of feel like, wait, why has it become this way? Well, that's sort of the more natural way that the brain is, and that most of the world is that way. There's this great researcher, I'm blanking on his name now, but he coined this term about weird people, and he wrote this book about the weirdest people in the world. And the problem with a lot of psychology experiments is that they've been conducted on weird people, and he's using weird in a particular way as an acronym for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And those elements of our lives actually change the way our brains develop, and they change how we view other people, and how we view people who are part of our network or people who are not part of our network. And the sort of default functioning of the brain, which is the way that most people in the world is that you have separate rules for how you behave and interact with people who you are closely connected to versus other people. People who you're connected to, you should trust, and people who you're not connected to, you shouldn't trust. And it's just this weird feature of America that like we're actually the most trusting of strangers of like any country on earth. And so we're kind of like, why are we devolving, into this bizarre thing where we're seeing everyone as enemies? And it's like, well, like that's that's sort of the better question was like, how were we possibly able to like not see it that way? And in some ways, well, that's probably a rosy view of the past. Like, there's always been sexism and racism. It's just the ways that our tribalism have been expressed is different now because of social media and our awareness and connectedness with other people. And like a lot of that stuff was going on before. We just weren't as in the broader media or like the white, elite media, like weren't aware of all of this stuff. And now we are aware of it. It was going on all along, and now it's affecting us more.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of this barrage of it, I guess, and so it's hard to step away or get away from it for a little bit, or prioritize like your outrage, right? I mean, there's only so much empathy anybody has. You can
Right.
always dialed up to 10. There's no place to go.
Yeah, and that's a problem. Like the how relevant things are and how much we should prioritize them is really hard to know because our lives are so complex. And again, like in the olden days, 50,000 years ago, like it was much easier. Like life itself was more difficult, perhaps. But the choices that you had to make were less gray. They're clear. Like, well, you gotta survive and do what you need to help your tribe. And it's like fairly straightforward. And like that's all you need to do. And also like, and everyone in your tribe was kind of all on the same page, and they're all sort of working for the same thing. And now like the thing that we're working towards is a much more abstract idea of, freedom and liberty and happiness and even like what we mean when we say those words is different between different people. So we could use the same words, but like if I use the word freedom, or sorry, if you use the word freedom, then I have to know, like, well, do you mean the same thing as me? Like, can I trust you and be like, oh yeah, we need more, reproductive freedom or whatever. Versus like, oh, are you trying to, mean something totally different, in which case I need to argue against you, or even like, are you just pretending to mean the same thing as me so that then I'll trust you so that then you can take advantage of me? And like, it's really hard to know these things. And by
Yeah.
the way, they're just like, I think, both sides like to see themselves as morally
Oh,
superior.
yeah.
And I think that is one of the things that keeps us stuck, is that it feels so good and it so activates our reward system to have this righteous sense of indignation, and it like makes you feel powerful and connected to your tribe. And that's great that it makes you feel good, but it's helpful to take a step back to realize like, oh, but just because something like feels good in the moment doesn't make it good for me. And it can become addictive in the same way that, drugs or alcohol do that. Like they're not addictive because they're bad for us. They're addictive because they help us. It's just that they only help us in the short term, and in the long term, they harm us. But the habit region of the brain doesn't make a distinction between, like, say, good habits and bad habits. All habits benefit us in the short term. It's just that if they also benefit us in the long term, we call them a good habit. And if they harm us in the long term, then we call it a bad habit. But it's crucial to recognize, like, we do these things because they feel good, because they benefit us in the short term. And the only way to sort of to step out of that is to recognize, like, oh, this is actually hurting me in the long term. The more that you view the other side as evil, well, if your goal is a multicultural society where we get along, then you're getting in your own way of that. Because like you have to figure out a way to coexist with them, and it oftentimes means we have to change our habits.
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody I was talking to was, talking about. I think it was Pete Ditto was talking about how this our democracy goes against all these natural tendencies, and
Mm-hmm.
but in America, in the American system, and in what how the way we've laid it out, we sort of need to be able to interact and collaborate in some way with people that we pretty much have big differences with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so anti to our nature to want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it, like, when it feels difficult, I like to remind myself of this quote. I think Obama's chief of staff had this like written on his like a desk plaque or something, which is just hard things are hard. So that like when it feels difficult, like, we have so much, strife and discord, and there's so many problems in the world. It's like, well, yeah, like there's nothing that says like this should be easy to solve. So we often, unfortunately, though, get stuck because we can envision a world in which it's easy to solve, or we remember other instances when we're unified. And like this ability to imagine alternate realities is an amazing feature of the human brain. But it just means that sometimes we can easily imagine a different world where, like, well, why don't everyone treats each other with kindness? And but then it just, all that succeeds is often to make us dissatisfied with the world that we have right now. And like, it's perfectly fine to have an idealized idea of where you're trying to get to, but you can't take action on that. You need to know, like, well, what can I do now to, like, help me get there? And if there's nothing that you can do now, then envisioning this alternate reality is unhelpful. I often describe, like, when I coaching clients, when I help people, who are smart, passionate professionals who, like, get stuck in, overthinking, or just want to be better leaders or better at sales or whatever, it really comes down to these two key things, which is identifying, like, well, what is most important and what's less important, and what can you take action on, or in other words, what can you control and what can you not control? And until you're clear about that landscape, you're always going to be distracted by things that are out of your control or unimportant or both. And when you fully understand these things, and it makes you able to prioritize, to devote your limited resources of attention and time and energy and money on the things that are most important, that you actually have some control over.
And maybe that's part of one of the challenges for our current culture is that there's so many things we feel like we don't have control over, and we still consider it kind of important, but we kind of feel like, I don't know what to do with it or how I should do anything about it.
No, exactly. And, like, this lack of control activates our fight or flight stress response. That's a response throughout the body, where heart rate goes up, and we're ready to fight or flee, or even freeze, like just be paralyzed and not do anything, because sometimes that's the safest thing. And the amygdala is constantly paying attention for threats. And one of the things that it's paying attention to is, like, what is potentially out of my control. And sometimes just things pop into our head. It's like, oh my God, I can't control. Like, what if I don't have enough money for that? What if, someone doesn't like me? Like, these are things potentially we don't have control over. But, like, the more that we consciously direct our attention, or that other sources are, like, our social media platforms are directing our attention towards things we can't control, it's making that problem worse. Because the more that we pay attention to things that we can't control, the more out of control we feel, and the greater reactivity of our amygdala and the rest of the emotional circuitry and the stress response, which pushes us back into our old habits. And so there are many people that can profit off of that.
I'm pretty sure I've heard you talk about, like, we can't control those thoughts that pop into our head, like that just happens. Mm-hmm. But one thing we can do is pick something we can control. And you even talk about this idea of, what can I do? Well, I can make dinner. That's the thing I can actually do.
Right.
And you talk about how that kind of thing can help. I think, if I got that right.
Yeah. I mean, so you don't have control over these random thoughts that pop into your head. What often happens is, like, this thought pops into your head, and that triggers an emotion, and that emotion triggers some habit, either an action habit or another thought pattern habit or an emotional habit. And these deeper regions of the brain, the emotional circuits, the habit circuits, they're perfectly happy going, like, living your life without your awareness. They're like autopilot, in the same way that, like, a pilot can, start flying the plane and then just puts it on autopilot and then flies it to Chicago. And, like, that's actually a really helpful feature. But at some point, if they're like, oh, Chicago's closed, okay, well, then you need to turn off autopilot, because otherwise it's like you're going to be trying to go this way and the autopilot's going to be fighting against you. And it's just that, like, in our brains, it's really helpful to recognize, like, oh, what are those things that turn on the autopilot, and what and it's really not turn it on or turn it off. It's sort of like an increase or decrease. And even if you can't turn it off, it's extremely helpful to just notice and be aware that it's happening. In the same way, like, you're, as a pilot, if for whatever reason the autopilot was stuck on, then you're just like, oh, it's stuck on. Okay, I just need to tilt the wheel or whatever. I don't know what it's called in an airplane.
Right.
I just need to tilt it, 15 degrees this way to counteract the autopilot. And it's like, oh, like, you can't control necessarily when your autopilot is triggered. You can't control the habits that have already been programmed into it for your whole life up to this point. All you can do is recognize your own tendencies and then accept the things that you can't control and redirect your attention to the things you can actually do something about. And that's really difficult because the world is complex. It's not always clear what we can control and can't control. And it's really easy to confuse things that we can control with what we can't control. Like, I can control mostly what I say to you and the words I use. What I can't control is how you will interpret those words and your emotional reaction. And so a lot of times we're focused on, like, well, it's important for me, for you to like me, or it's important for me to convince you that I'm right, or whatever. And so we're focused on the outcome of this interaction as being really important. But that stresses us out because it's like, oh, but I don't know, well, what's the right word that I could just say if I just said this? Oh, you're taking me out of context, whatever. And so it becomes really stressful because we're focused on some outcome that we don't have control over that's really important to us, and neglecting, like, well, what do I actually have control over? And in the face of things that are really important that you don't have control over, the only useful path forward is just accept that and move forward, and to refocus your energy on the things that you actually have control over. And so I can't make you believe me or care about me or whatever. All I can do is, keep going, or strategize a different way. And one of the things that gets in the way of that is, like, it feels so good to be right and score political points and, like, prove someone wrong, that, like, our brains just get confused. Like, oh, it just feels so good. Oh, in the short term, like, oh, that must be really important. But in fact, it's getting in the way of what's actually important to you, is, like, connecting with and understanding this person who has different experiences and different perspectives.
Yeah. I think I've also heard you talk about when you do have one of these kind of big, overwhelming kind of goals, that sometimes scaling back and focusing on the effort, like the next step you can take, and not thinking about the big goal, can also be helpful.
Yeah. Right. So, like, if you have some big goal to right the injustices of the world, or even, more concretely, like, I want to write a novel, or I want to run for political office. Like, it's wonderful to have big goals, as long as they're in line with your values. But it's wonderful to have big goals insofar as they are inspiring and motivate action and help keep us focused. But sometimes we have big goals that are really important to us, and we don't have confidence in our ability to get there. And in that case, the goal might be really important, but focusing on it might actually just stress you out and make you not take action. Like it might be really important for you to write the next great American novel. But the more you're telling yourself, okay, I need to write the next great American novel, like then the more you might stress yourself out and not write at all. And so what you have to do is like, okay, just keep that goal maybe as important in the back of your mind, but not focus on it so much. And instead focus on the things that are controllable that would move you towards that goal. So in, the writing a novel example, like, well, I can't control how many people read it or how much critics like it, or even if I like it. All I really can control is like writing words. I can't
Right.
control if they're good words or the best words. No, I can't control, when I am writing, like if the things that I'm writing are interesting or meaningful, all I can sort of do is just write and then edit. And if I try and write and edit at the same time, then I'm getting in my own way because I'll start to write something and then I'll tell myself, no, but that's not quite right. And so then again, it leads me to inaction. And really all you have control over is sitting in front of your computer that's for a certain amount of time and like how fast you can type. And so, but people often confuse like, well, I need to feel inspired or I need to want to write. And it's like, well, you don't have control over those emotions. And so you really just need to recognize like, well, okay, I'm going to sit in front of my computer. I'm going to start writing words. And when the thought pops into my head of that's dumb or that's pointless or that's not helpful, well, I have to remind myself, yep, that's okay. My goal is just to write. Now I can rewrite it later.
So I was talking earlier about how, a lot of times we try to get some idea of like, are there some actions we can take or some things we can do? And many times I have to say that they kind of start to sound a little cliche. Now, and I don't want to totally, sort of be negative on cliche because sometimes cliche stuff kind of works. Like take a deep breath, do some of those things.
Sure.
They aren't terrible things. But, one thing I wanted to think about is this idea that.
But by the way, like the take a deep breath thing, I found people object to that because it's like, just someone telling you to do it. That's why I love the neuroscience, because like the neuroscience tells you like, no, like slowing down your breathing, not actually the depth of your breathing, but slowing it down and smoothing it out pushes your brain away from the fight or flight stress response and towards this calming rest and digest response. And the reason why that's critical is because when you're stressed, you're just automatically being pulled into these old habits. And if you can just calm yourself down, then it makes it easier for the thoughtful, more analytical parts of the brain to intervene. And so you're not taking a breath for no reason or to just like interrupt things. You're doing it because that's a simple way to influence the emotional circuitry of your brain to just get it to calm down for a second.
Like you're okay. We're not being chased. We're not going to be eaten by the lion right
now. Exactly. And it's easier often to control your actions than it is to like notice your thoughts and argue with your thoughts. Like you could do it in sort of a totally mental way. It's just that that's more abstract and when you're really stressed out, like the abstract thinking parts of your brain are being overwhelmed. And so like it's just easier sometimes to focus on specific actions like that, like taking deep breath or just go to sleep on time tonight, or get some sunlight or get some exercise or just hang out with your friends. And just like there are general simple things that help reduce the reactivity of our stress response, they're very easy to dismiss by smart, goal-oriented people as like, oh, but that's just dumb. And it's like,
that's that new age nonsense.
No. Right, exactly. That's that new age nonsense. And that's why I think it's so crucial to understand the brain. It's like, no, you idiot. Like, I mean, I'm talking to myself here.
Right.
I'm like, I just need to figure this out. I was like, no, you need to stop trying to think your way through everything. And like, sometimes it's just a dumb, like you need to eat food. Like those Snickers commercials where like you get hangry and someone's like, all right, like, sometimes the answer is dumb and stupid. Like you don't need to figure out your bigger picture. You just need to eat a Snickers bar and
Right.
like get your blood sugar up and like make sure that you're getting enough sleep and getting enough physical activity. And that's kind of like the baseline to
It
get your
takes almost
brain
no training or expertise to be able to calm your breath
right.
down, right?
And then
Something
from there,
anyone can do.
exactly. And then from there, when your stress response is calmed down a little bit, then you can start taking some of these more abstract, mental focuses and shifts because you're not being so distracted all the time by some of your physiological needs.
Right. Yeah. So maybe the question I'm going to ask is almost like, well, you just answered it because we're going to,
Right.
we
So
do
we can do
other
those
things.
next things, right? So like you do those baseline things and you can read. I mean, that's like what a lot of the upward spiral is about. And people oftentimes they don't want to hear that part. They're like, no, what are the little tricks and whatever? It's like, okay,
Right.
start with the basic stuff. And here I will explain to you why you should care about that and how there are the simple ways to rewire your brain. And a lot of times when smart people hear that, they're like, oh, okay, like it's not just some, you know, guru or influencer telling me to exercise. Oh, now I see why I should do it. It increases motivation. But once you do all those basic things, then yes, there are a lot of like different mindset shifts and higher order things that you can do, which I'm happy to talk
Well,
about.
well, one of the big things I was thinking about, we talked earlier a little bit about this idea that this outrage porn, we do get this immediate short-term benefit out of it, but then we kind of, realize it's this longer one. I mean, we're stressed out all the time. We're stressed. So is there a way to sort of realize or see that long-term benefit is bad? And is there some way there you can kind of do something?
Yeah, it really comes down to being honest with yourself about what actually is important in your life and what your limitations are, what you can control. And um, a lot of times we have many things that are important. And yeah, if you had infinite time and infinite energy and infinite resources, then like, sure, like volunteer for, saving the planet and, volunteer for your PTA at the school and, make a lot of money and write a novel and like, but at some point you have to realize like, oh, I'm human. And part of being human is like, well, you don't have infinite energy, you don't have infinite ability to focus. And given your limitations and that you can't have everything that you want, like what is the most important thing right at this moment? And ironically, once you start to prioritize and recognize that maybe you can't have everything, it actually makes it easier to have everything. Because if you're trying to have everything all at once, like, well, I want a job that makes a lot of money and that gives me a lot of time to do other things and that I feels meaningful and I enjoy doing it and whatever, like, and you're trying to get everything all at once and you can't figure out how to do it. So you just kind of feel dissatisfied and maybe you don't make any progress. Where instead, if you're just like, okay, yes, all of these things, I want a job that makes money and I want a job that makes me happy and I want this. And okay, given all those things, if you had to choose, like which would be your highest priority and focus on that. And then sometimes when we just focus on one thing, then other stuff falls into place or we realize like, oh, well, the most important thing for my job is that I make enough money to but not for no reason. But it's so that I can support my family because my family is the most important thing. And I'm doing my job not because it's unenjoyable. Like, if it's unenjoyable, that's fine. That's just something I can accept because it's helping move me towards my more important value of helping my family. And so if I can figure out some other way to support my family that is also more enjoyable, great, do that. And if I can't, then when my job is unenjoyable, I can accept it. I'd be like, my brain will be like, oh, this is so boring. And I'd be like, yeah, it's boring. I'm not doing it because it's fun. I'm doing it because I'm trying to support my family, and I can have fun in other ways.
And it seems like in this outrage porn context, I mean, it seems like one of the, you know, there's, if you're a person that's already kind of realized I'm angry all the time, or I'm exhausted by it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it seems like then you're at least ready to take that next step to try something different. So there's
Right.
probably a couple of audiences. One is that the ones that kind of don't know they're there yet, but I'm mostly trying to speak to the people that have kind of starting to say this. I'm too. This is, you know, I'm angry all the time. I'm
Right.
obviously exhausted by it. So, you know, what are some of the things? So I think that what you were talking about there are all things that kind of apply in that context.
Right. I mean, it's really like the aside from the physical things, like the mental things you can do is really one, like clarify in your mind, like what are the things that are most important to me? And chances are, if you're feeling stuck somewhere, you're wrong about that somewhere. You think something is really important, but it's actually not. I always describe it as like when the oxygen mask falls down on an airplane, they say, put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. Are you doing that to be selfish and get all of the oxygen? Or are you doing that because helping yourself will actually help you help others? And I think, but that really comes down to understanding and recognizing your limitations. And so, yeah, you could give away all of your money to charity, or you could never consume anything. But like, would that help you help others the way you want to, or would that help you be the person you want to be? But it again comes down to clarifying what your values are and what's most important, and in terms of and accepting the things that you can't control, so that you can focus your energy on the things that you can control.
Yeah. It all comes down to the serenity prayer.
No, I mean, it's like it really is the serenity prayer. And I don't like bringing it up because sometimes people are like, oh, they dismiss it, like, oh, it seems religious, or it seems like, you know,
Right.
I have feelings about AA. But it's like, well, but yeah, these are the principles that guide your brain. The deeper regions are going to focus on the things you can control, the things that are most immediately pleasurable, and the higher order, more advanced analytical parts, like the prefrontal cortex, like that cares about like your long-term goals, and it can override your immediate impulses and habits in the service of some long-term goals. But you have to actually, you know, think about what those are, and you're going to make mistakes sometime, which is something you can't control, which is going to stress you out and going to push you back into your old habits and blah, blah, blah. Like, and so it's so easy to fall into these old habits. And the reason why it's so important to be aware of this process is because, like, in the absence of being aware of it, like, well, then you're just going to be on autopilot, and you're going to be an alcoholic, or you're going to be, oppressing other people. You're going to be, going against your own values.
You're going to be
some way.
doom scrolling right before you go to bed, and you're not going to get a good night's sleep.
Right. Exactly. But why should you care about that? It's like,
right.
Well, you can live your life. You can doom scroll and disrupt your sleep. Like, why do you care? It's like, oh, well, I want to, be more rested and motivated and less stressed. Like, but why? It's like, oh, well, because it would help me help other people. It helped me connect with my family. And like getting to those deeper whys are the key to changing your habits. Then the actual key to changing your habits is stupid stuff like the triggers and like little dumb stuff. But like the bigger picture is often like if you can really focus on what is most important to you, it helps to reduce your stress. And then when your habits are pushing you in one direction towards what's easiest and most immediately pleasurable, your prefrontal cortex, your analytical circuits can intervene and be like, yeah, we could do that. But you know what? We've done that for the last 10 years, and it's led us to exactly where we are right now. So maybe we should try this other thing, because that might actually take us, right? That might actually take us where we're trying to go. And because it's new and unknown, your emotional circuitry is like, I don't know, that's unknown. And it's going to want to push you back into your old habits. And again, it's helpful to be like, recognize that this is a sort of like a committee that's talking in your brain of like, yeah, we could do that. And instead of trying to shout at yourself, like, that's so stupid, it's why you like, oh, like to treat yourself with compassion, treat yourself with reflection and be like, realize you've done this experiment a million, 100 times before already and be like, and it keeps turning out this way. So let's try something different because we know kind of with a high degree of certainty that the way we're doing things now doesn't work. So the fact that if I tried something new and that also doesn't work, that's fine. Like I've learned something, but even if it is only 10% better, well, that's better than doing the same thing over and over again that I know doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, that's perfect. There's the why. It's kind of like, oh, the 4-year-olds had it right all along. Just keep asking why.
It is true. But you're right. At some point, I mean, that's the opposite thing is that like if you were smart and analytical person, like this is sometimes a lot of the people I talk to too, we like overthink things and be like, but why is this? But why is that? And you could keep asking questions like that, like a philosopher forever. But at some point you should ask yourself, like, okay, am I trying to understand this so that I can take better action? Or is this just thinking just actually getting in the way of taking action? Like, right. You might need to know like, well, should I prioritize, recycling my, whatever plastic bottles, or should I prioritize, driving less or whatever? And we could say, oh, I don't know, like look into all the details and like never end up doing anything. And you have to realize like, oh, well, I have limited time and resources. So it's like, it's better to do one small step in the right direction than to just spend an increasingly amount of time thinking about it, not making any changes at all. And whether when to know if you're falling into the trap of overthinking is again, like, well, look at your own tendencies. Like, oh, that's interesting. Like I'm telling myself it's really important that I think about this and make the perfect decision. But like, I always think that about every decision and it really gets in my way. So I just have to, instead of trying to make the perfect best decision, I just have to pick any of these 10 options that are better than what I'm doing right now. And if I realize later on that there's a better thing, okay, then I'm going to choose that. But like, don't try and make everything perfect with all at once, make the best decision, just make one small change that is better than the default. And that's really what the upward spiral is all about, because making one small change that isn't quite perfect, what's going to change your activity and chemistry of key brain circuits, which is going to then make it clearer about what the path should be or make it easier about what your next change should be.
Right. Yeah, and then what you were describing there was pretty much exactly kind of the path that I ended up getting to, or that's kind of where the title of the podcast comes from. Yeah. I sort of reached my overload. Like, this is not working anymore. I'm like, I was one of those guys that shared everything and, was looking at all the outrage porn out there and, and realized this is not working anymore.
Yeah.
And, you had, like you said, you come up with something, you try something different, right?
Yeah. And that's like, this is one of the hardest things for people to do who are smart, passionate, goal-oriented people, is to accept that they can't do everything, that they have limitations. And you could have gone on Twitter more and you could have shared more articles. And you could do that, but at some point you're like, oh, but I can't do that and be happy. And so at some point you have to make a choice, like, oh, like, well, which do I want to prioritize? And sure, if you could do both, do both. But like you came to the point where like, oh, I can't do both. And that freed you up to prioritize the things that were more important. And then the habit part of your brain is like, oh, but just go online one more time or just share this thing. And that's where you have to be like, to answer it, you have to be like, yeah, I've tried that path and it hasn't gotten me where I want to go. So I'm going to like, thank you for your input. but like, you don't need to get mad at your brain for making these suggestions. And that's where understanding the neuroscience is helpful, because you can have compassion towards yourself. Like, oh, I understand why,
Right.
I'm
It's
trying
actually
to
trying to be helpful kind of thing.
right.
Your brain is trying to help you.
Exactly. Your brain is trying to help you. In the same way that your mom, when you were a kid and walking outside, she's like, oh, don't, bring a sweater. We're like, Mom, I know I can be cold. Like, she's trying to help you, like, be safe and not be cold. And so just like with your mom, you should show your appreciation and be like, oh, like, thank you. I appreciate you trying to take care of me, but like, I'm going to do this other thing instead. And that again involves reflection and self-compassion and clarifying your values and mindfulness. And that's like, that's why when I work with people on these things, like, it's really a comprehensive approach, because there's not just like one like little simple life hack or brain hack that you can change. It's a spiral.
Right. Yeah. It all kind of builds up. Well, that's fantastic. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Again, I'm overwhelmed. All right. Well, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate the time. I had so much fun. And again, thanks for coming on and making the time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, and I hope that was useful. It was great talking with you.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. I want to take a moment to thank those that have contributed to the show. Your support helps us cover costs to continue to improve the show and is greatly appreciated. For as little as $3 a month, you can become a subscriber to get access to exclusive subscriber-only content, sneak peeks into what's coming, behind-the-scenes exclusive content, and you can learn about upcoming guests in advance and even submit questions for the interview. Visit outrageoverload.net/contribute. Okay, see you in a few weeks.